So this is the lesson that we'll be following along, and we're not going to do it completely in order, but I'll try to explain so you can keep up. And then if you need to get back on track, you should be able to just copy these code cells. You can also navigate between the R, or if you click on Python, that will show you the equivalent thing to do in Python. And there are some small differences in the Neon utilities packages for R and Python, so I'll try to point those out, but for the most part, the syntax will be really similar as much as possible, at least for the Neon utilities aspects. Okay, with that said, let's get started. And I'm just going to share my entire screen. Actually, you know what? I'll share this. Okay. Okay. So before we start jumping into the code packages, I just want to give a quick overview of downloading the data from the data portal. And this is one way you can download the data locally and then start working with it in your programming language of choice. Or you can do it all directly through R or Python. But I'll just show the first step of what you would do when you're first looking for Neon data. So the data website is data.neonscience.org. And if you go to this Explore Data Products page, this is the landing page for all of the Neon data products. And this is kind of where you would go if you're not sure what you want to work with or if you want to learn more information about your data products of interest. So it actually does save your history, and you can say reset all filters at the top if you've looked for something else. But if you scroll down here, you can see, I think it's alphabetically ordered, and there's different ways to filter through the data products. So on the left, we have a search bar. You can search for keywords or the data product ID if you know that. Other information, like you can search by the science team. You can search by visualization. So for example, for the AOP data, there's this data viewer, and then you can click on that to pull up kind of spatial data. This is just one example of the albedo data product. And to get started, we'll actually start by just exploring the PAR data product. And there's both, I think I had clicked on AOP data viewer, so I'll unclick this. But if you search PAR and don't have anything else selected, it should show up this photosynthetically active radiation data product first. That data product ID is DP1.00024.001. You don't need to worry about this too much, except for that when we get into the code packages, you will need to know the data product ID when you're downloading data. So that's kind of the reference, but you can, if you're not sure what data product is associated with what ID, this is where you would go to learn that. So let's go ahead and click on this data product. And this is one of the IS data product or instrumented system data products. And hopefully you all by now are familiar with the various data product sensor types on a large, kind of on a high level. So those are the IS or instrumented system, OS or observational system, and then the AOP or remote sensing system data products. So here we're looking at one of the IS ones, and this is something that's on the tower, and you can learn more about it just by reading the description here. So I'll just have you take a second to read through this, but basically it's just the radiation flux, and it gives the wavelengths, and it's available at 1 and 30-minute averages of 1 Hertz observations. And then these observations are made at multiple heights on the tower by sensors located as well as by some of the aquatic sensors. So with that said, if you're downloading through the GUI or the web page, I'll also point out there's a number of all of the related documents to this data product are included in this data portal page. And so we really encourage you to look through these documents when you're starting to work with the data product. If you're not sure where to get started, we have these what are called quick start guides that are embedded in the page. And so this gives you kind of just a really quick 2.5-page summary of the data product, how it's collected, the contents of the data product. So you'll see here, we'll get into this in a little bit, all the content types, and then some information about the data quality and how you can find more information about that. And then finally, there's information about the calculations. And then for data products where you might need to join different tables together, different files together, there's information about that as well. So we'll scroll down. There's also an issue log, and this is important to pay attention to it because your site of interest may have been affected. For example, with the aquatic sensors or some of the other sensors, if there's a flooding event, there might be disruptions to that data product. So that's what this example is showing you here. There was a flooding in Yellowstone National Park, which made these sites inaccessible and affected the data product. So that's something to pay attention to as well. And then finally, at the very bottom, you can start downloading the data by clicking on this icon. And before we do that, this chart here is what's called an availability chart. And anything in dark blue here means that data are available. Anything in this kind of lighter hashed blue color that you see kind of on the right here is provisional data, which means it has not gone through an official release. So that's just something to keep in mind. And for a lot of the data products, IS and AOP, for example, there's a year-long lag period where data before in mid 2024 was part of the 2025 release, and then data beyond that is still potentially going through quality review before it's officially released. So that's also something important to keep in mind here. So that said, let's go ahead and download some data. And this basically just takes you through a little workflow where you can select various things that you're interested in. So for this, to follow along with the tutorial online, we'll select the Wind River site. So you can just click on that. It's the second to the bottom, and the code is WREF, and that's one of our sites in the Pacific Northwest. And then we'll select a subset of data from, select the year first, from 2019, September, to, let's do 2019. Oops, sorry. And then let's do, just select a month after September. I think it was November. So it's a little bit, this little search is a little bit clunky, but at the end you should see September 2019 to November 2019. And then if you scroll down, you should see those months highlighted in your availability chart here. So that's what you're selecting of all the data products, or of all the sites and times. Okay, we can go ahead to next. In this case, we don't need to include provisional data because we saw that all of those months that we're looking at are released. But if you're looking at data in between provisional or released, you might want to say include. In this case, it doesn't really matter. And then finally, you can select which package you want. So the basic package includes kind of the basic information, including the data product, summary statistics, expanded uncertainty, and then the final quality flag. Whereas the expanded package includes additional quality metrics that you would probably need to go through and read more about in the ATBD or some of those documents. So for now, we'll just select basic, but just be aware that if you want to dive into the data more in depth, you may wish to look at the expanded package. And then finally, you just have to agree to the usage and citation policies. They're linked here. And you can also get this information from the Neon utility, so I'll show that as well. But you do have to agree to those terms and just say that you will properly cite Neon data when you use it for research. Okay, so now we've gone through that workflow. At the top right corner, we can see that the estimated size is 114 megabytes. For this IS data, we selected a small date range and just for one site. But for other data products, for example, the eddy covariance, or for AOP data, this might be a pretty large volume. So this is just something to be aware of and make sure you have enough space on your computer before downloading. So I'll go ahead and download. Again, on the right, there are some guidance for citations. You can just copy that right here if you're planning on using this for any sort of published research. Okay, so it's downloading up here. And I actually already downloaded this, so I'll just switch my screen. I'm sharing. 1 second. Okay, and then if you look in your download folder, you should see a folder like this, a zipped Neon PAR. I'll just use my earlier one. And then if you look in this, we'll just briefly go over what you downloaded. And then if you remember from that quick start guide, that also describes the contents of what was downloaded. So we see we have these 3 folders. We have a number of documents. These are those documents I was talking about that describe the data product and how to use it and the theory behind it. And then we have a folder for each month that we downloaded. So there's this naming convention, the data product ID is in there, and then the date. So we have 2019-09, basic, 2019-10, and then 2019-11. And we also have I believe the date here is the date that that was published and the release at the end. So if we look in each of these folders, we see that there are a number, oops, sorry, we're just expanding here. We see that there's a bunch of files here. So we have par, it's called, it should just, I don't know why it's called par, but we have par at 1 minute and then 30 minutes. And then we have a number of those files and we have them at the number here. The 10 indicates the tower position. So we have them at different levels of the towers as we go up the tower. So you can imagine that working with these CSV files or Excel files individually would be a lot to manage. And that's exactly what the Neon Utilities packages are designed to do, is to help you work with these and wrangle these data so that you can get them all in a single data frame or data type of interest and then work with them all together. So with that preview, we'll just go to R. I'll go to R, and then you can either go to Python or R, depending on your preference. And then we'll mostly follow along with the lesson, but I'll point out where that differs if you're getting lost. So I'm going to use RStudio, and hopefully everyone has that installed or their IDE of choice. Okay. So I just created a new R file. You can either use R or R Markdown, but I'll just do R for simplicity here. And then what we're going to do in the next part of this, or the rest of this in-person part, is just do some live coding. So we'll try to get through as much as we can, but I may take some shortcuts. So in the lesson, basically, if you've already downloaded the data, then you would go through a workflow of, and I'll go through this real quickly, but you go through a few functions to basically pull in those files and then read them all into the same data frame. So before we get started, we'll just import a couple libraries, and there's instructions for installing them, but hopefully you were able to see the pre-set up instructions, so I'm not going to go through those right now. So the first library we'll use is this Neon Utilities, and then you can run that single line. You can see it's running down here. We'll also use, sorry, just adjusting my window here. And is this big enough for everyone to see? I can make it a little, hopefully.
So we cannot see the right side completely.
How's that?
Better.
Okay. I think the main thing here is just to look at the code, but yeah, Shashi, just let me know if adjustments are needed. Okay, we'll also use the Neon OS package. And then finally, we'll use the Terra package, which is a raster specific package. So go ahead and run all those library imports. And we've already downloaded data. And so this part may be specific. You might have to make some adjustments depending on where you downloaded the data to. But I'm just going to do a little shortcut here to read in my root path. So I'll just call it root path. And then you can use this sys library to get the environment and get my username. So this, if you already know your username on your computer, you can just type that in directly. But I'll just show you what this is giving you. So run, and then if I do print root path, it's basically just giving me, okay, my user folder is C users B Haas, yours will be different. And then I'm going to point to where the PAR data was downloaded. So I'm using the file path and then going to my downloads folder, downloads, and then it was called Neon PAR zip. And you can go, you don't need to unzip the file in your folder. You can just read in the zip file and then we'll work from there. So basically, let's run that. And then if you look at your path, make sure that if you look in your file directory, this is actually where your data is landed. And if not, make sure that your PAR path, you can even just copy and paste to that path directly. And my slashes are kind of messed up, but this should still work. Okay, so then once you've located your data, we can basically just use this function stack by table. It's one of the Neon Utilities functions. And I believe you can do, and apologies to everyone because R is not my first language, so I may have to look some of these commands up, but I think you can just do question mark stack by table. And in the right-hand corner, if you're confused about what any function does, You can look up the syntax or the description here. So you can see here the inputs are the file path, a save path. By default, you don't need to include that. And then some other information. You need actually, that's all you really need is the path. It should read everything in, but we'll go ahead and run that. So stack by table, and then let's enter our par path. Okay, so it might take a minute to run this, but basically what this is doing, if you go into your folder where that neon par data was created, this function is taking all that data and stacking it together in a way that you can access all the data in a single method. So I'll just switch back. I think I will see the best way to do this. And you should see the progress bar going. Mine, I think, is very slow right now for some reason. But I'll take the time just to, if you go into your own folder where you downloaded the data, if I can find it. This may not be exactly what I wanted to share, but I'll find it. So in my downloads folder, neon par, oops, sorry. It looks like it's unzipping it. And then, sorry for the lag here. And then it's creating this stacked files folder that has, instead of all those individual files, you'll have par 1 minute, par at 30 minutes, and then other information like the sensor position, variables. And like I mentioned from the data portal, there are things like the issue log, a README, and then citation information. So feel free to explore those on your own, but this is just to show you what that stack by table function is doing. And go back to R. Okay. Okay, so it looks like it took 1.5 minutes for mine to run. Hopefully everyone's ran. Okay, so now that we've done stack by table, we can use a function called read table neon to actually read that information in. So this line will be a little bit longer, but feel free to reference the online tutorial and copy and paste if that's easier for you. So we'll use this read table neon function. And again, you can use that question mark read table neon to learn more about it. And then you have to specify the data file. And so here I'll say, basically, I'm just creating the file to that 30-minute par data average. So here I'm going to join my root path, downloads, neon par, and then it created that stacked files folder. And then the file I'm interested in is called par 30minute.csv. And then I also have to specify the variables file. And that I'm just going to copy because everything is going to be the same except for the end. And that one, the variables file was called variables 00024. And so, yeah, feel free to just copy and paste that path from your directory directly. And we'll go ahead and run this line. Okay, so now we can see that on the right-hand side in the variables, we can see this par 30 variable that we've created. And then we have all of this information associated with that variable. So the domain, site, horizontal position, vertical position, and then the actual values, the actual data, the par data. So the mean, minimum, maximum, and variance, as well as number of points and uncertainty. So this is the data that so for however many months of data you want to work with, you can collapse it all together and get it into a pretty simple structure to work with in this way using both stack by table and read table neon. So hopefully pretty straightforward. Now that we've gone through that process, I'll show an even quicker way to do those 2 steps, or actually the 3 steps of downloading, stacking, and then reading those data. You can do that basically all in one step using a function called load by product. So let's go ahead and just take a look at that function using the question mark here. So question mark load by product. And then here we can see the description. So this file, like I mentioned, gets files from the Neon AOP, stacks them, and loads them into the current environment. And for this one, instead of providing a data path, you'll just provide the data product ID, the sites. So by default, it's going to load all sites. So if you only want one site, you'll have to specify that. And then you can specify the start and end date, the package, basically all of the information that we had from the data portal you can select in this function.
Bridget, should we also mention about the token here?
Yes, very good point. Yeah. So as Shashi mentioned, that's a good point, and I'm kind of leaving it out for now because this wasn't a requirement, but there is a token that you can set up, and I'll drop a link to the lesson that shows you how to do that. But there's a token you can set up. We highly encourage people to sign up for this, and that basically speeds up your downloads and it gives you a faster rate of download essentially. And then it also helps us track who's using our data and what data. And we don't track your individual information. We just use your token to kind of help us determine usage. And as of now, this token is optional, highly recommended, but there is a high likelihood that next year this will actually be required. So yeah, apologies, I'm not teaching it here, but Shashi made a great point. This is something that is really important to keep in mind. And this is basically just a string you would get from your user account and you'd copy in that string, or there's different ways to handle that. So I'll be sure to include that link for you all. Okay, so that said, we'll go ahead and basically do the same thing we just did, except for instead of just reading in the par 30 data, we'll read in all the data using something called, we'll create a variable called par list. And then we'll use that load by product function. And the DPID is 00024.001. Again, if you don't remember what that is, you can go to the Neon product page. We'll select the same site of Wind River, WREF. And the start date of 2019-09, September, and then the end date of 2019-11, November. And then there's an optional argument. You can say check size. By default, that's true. Actually, I'll show what that looks like. You don't need to specify if it's true because that's what it is by default, but I'll just show you what that looks like. But if you're doing programmatic downloads and you don't want it to check the size before downloading and prompt you, you'll see down here it's saying continuing will download 100 megabytes. Do you want to proceed? Yes or no? And I'll go ahead and say Y for yes. So if you don't want that to pop up every time, you can just set this check size variable to F for false. So just something to keep in mind. And then another thing to keep in mind when you're working with data while this is running, you may or may not want to, like basically when you get into working with Neon data, you may download the data ahead of time that you want to use, like I showed either through the portal or through this, and you may not want to re-download the data every time. So there's a couple ways that you can work around that. You can either set your code so that you're not re-downloading every time, or there's another package even developed by community members called Neon Store that kind of helps you, that's geared around working with data that's already downloaded. So there's a few options there, but we do recommend to get the latest released data and the most up-to-date data to download fresh each time. Okay, so this might take a minute and a half because it's basically doing that same. You can see it's actually doing the same stacking function that we ran before. And here, this time it took a minute. And then we can see here, we have a new variable par list. And then in that par list, we have different variables. So we have our citation, issue log, we have the par at 1 minute, the par at 30 minutes, and then readme and sensor positions. So next we'll just explore this data a little bit. So if you don't want to look in the environment window over here on the top right corner, you can also explore the variables just by looking at the names of the par list. Oops, I'll do it up here just so we have a record of it. Go explore variables contained in this list. So we'll go ahead and run that. And here we can see the same thing I just pointed out. So we have our par 30 minutes and as well as those other variables. Okay, and then if we want to read in like we did before, just the par 30 data, we can do something like par 30 and then use the $ to access the par 30 minute data. So let's go ahead and read in just the par 30 data. And this will overwrite what we had read in before from the previous line, but it should be essentially the same information here. Okay, did I run that? par 30. Just running. Okay, yeah, I did run it. And then let's take a look at that data frame using the head command, which is just going to print the first looks like 6 values here. So here we can see the vertical position, the start time, end time, and all those data like we were looking at before. And from this, we can pretty easily just make a plot of the data too. And that's kind of a nicer way to visualize what we're looking at. So as a first step, we'll just plot the highest vertical position on the tower, which is 80 meters. So to do that, we'll use this plot command. Let's plot the mean. Oops, that should be lowercase. Par mean versus the end date time. And then for the data, we'll select par 30. And then to only select the 80-meter tower position, we'll use this which function. So where the par 30 vertical position is equal to 080. And you can determine what those are by looking into the data frame here. Okay, and then we'll just make a line plot. So go ahead and plot that. And then here, hopefully you can see this. Here's our plot of the mean par at that 80-meter station. And basically what you can see here from this 3-month interval is that there's this daily cyclical cycle. So the par is increasing and decreasing from day to night. And then as we're getting into the winter, it looks like the par is decreasing overall. And there are some days maybe that there are just a lot of clouds, like for example in here where the par just never gets that high. So pretty quick way just to make a nice time series of the data you're looking at. And then you can also look at, just as a last step, we'll look at 2 vertical positions just to compare those real quick. So for this, we'll do a very similar command here. So let's just we can rerun these cells together, but we'll just make the higher position colored in red. And then you can add on to that. Oops. So let's look at the par mean. Sorry. Versus the end date time again. And then for this one, instead of the 80 position, I'm just going to copy this and we'll look at, instead of 80, we'll look at the 20 vertical position. And then let's color that in yellow. Okay, so I'll just run these together. Let's see if this works if I just run this. Okay, yeah, so it just ran that on top of our last plot. So here we can see, I guess the color didn't change because I didn't rerun this, but we can see the black ones were the 80-meter tower position, and then the yellow here are the 20-meter tower position. So basically here we can see that there was a decent amount of light attenuation throughout the canopy as the lower tower position is getting less radiation than the higher position. So pretty straightforward, but again, just a different way to visualize that IS data. Okay. So that was IS, and we'll work with OS data. We'll use a lot of those same functions that we worked with, but with OS data, one of the things you need to get used to is understanding how to join different tables together. And so there's an extra function that we'll learn called join. Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm getting it right. Join table neon that we'll use to do some of that for us. And this joining function is not currently available in the Python version of the Neon Utilities package, but in the lesson there is code that shows you how to do those joinings. And again, always reference the quick start guides or the documentation if you're unsure what tables you need to join to get the data that you're interested in. Okay, so I'll just take a second if anyone has questions about IS data or this part of the tutorial so far. Okay, seems like no questions. Okay, in this next step, we will look at some of the observational data, and specifically we'll look at the aquatic plant chemistry data at a few different lake sites across the NEON Observatory. So we'll call our variable AP Chem. And again, we'll use that same load by product function. This time, the data product ID that we're interested in is DP1 20063.001. And then the sites, we can actually include a group of sites by just specifying them in this way. And so these are the sites: Prairie Lake, Suggs Lake, and Toolik Lake, kind of spread across the country. Toolik is in Alaska, and then Prairie Lake is in I believe, Kansas in the Prairie Campaign. For this one, we'll load the expanded package, and then we can specify the release. I think in the lesson, we said release 2024, but we can go ahead and do 2025 to get the latest. And then I'll just set check size to be false, just to avoid that prompt. But feel free to check it if you're worried about space. Okay, so it found 31 files, and we actually took all years of data for this because we didn't specify the start and end time here. Okay, so it's unzipping, it's stacking, and then it just finished here. So again, you can explore the variable up here, or by code, you can do the same thing we did before and just say, look at the names of what we downloaded. So names, AP Chem, to see the contents of that object. Okay, so it looks like we have something called biomass, clip harvest, plant external lab data per sample, external lab summary data, and then kind of some ancillary data here as well. So we're going to work with a couple of these tables here, and they're separated often because the data are collected in different ways, and then sometimes the data are added in the field, and then sometimes there's, like, for example, chemistry data sent back to a lab for processing, and then it gets uploaded as a separate table. But we want to work with the data all together, so we need to learn how to join those different data products together, or those different tables together. Okay, so you can also, if you don't want to work with the data in a way where you would have to specify AP Chem and then use the $ to get to the variable of interest, we can actually load all of these into our environment separately using something called list to environment, list to env. And then we can just add them to our global environment in this way using AP Chem and then global env. Okay, so now you can see, in addition to the data here, we actually have all those variables read in separately. So we have the APL biomass, the clip harvest, and we can just start working with those variables directly. So it's really your preference, but this might be a little bit simpler to know what you're working with. Okay, so now that we have all of these variables loaded, let's just make a quick plot here. So we'll start with a box plot. And let's look at the analyte concentration, which is part of the APL plant external lab data per sample. So if we go into that, sorry, it's a mouthful here. If we go into that data product up here, or that table up here, we can see analyte concentration is one of those variables. And so basically this is the percentage of enriched. In this case, we can specify the subset, but we'll look at the D13 or enriched carbon value here. So we'll plot against site ID so that we can see a plot for each of the different sites. Our data set is that plant, and you can, I think you can use, yeah, tab complete. If it starts to populate, you can use tab. Okay, so our subset will use the analyte is equal to D13C. So that's the carbon isotope. And then the X label is site, and Y label, let's call it D13C. Okay, so go ahead and run that. Oops, I might have mistyped here. Oh, I didn't say subset. Okay, so hopefully everyone was able to get a box plot similar to this. And we can see just on a high level that there are some differences between these three sites. So SUG has quite a tighter distribution of data here. Toolik is kind of on the lower side of the D13, and then PRLA is a little bit enriched potentially. So you may also be interested in separating that out, not just by site, but by the different species, because different species probably have different D13 concentrations. And so to do that, we actually need to use the join table neon function. because we need to join the biomass table with the external lab sample data, which are not by default provided together. So to do that, we'll do this. We'll create a new variable, and then basically we're just joining these using this function join table neon. And if you're using Python, again, this function doesn't exist in Python, so you'll have to just use basically some of the pandas merge functions to do this, the same thing, and that code is provided for you. Okay, so now let's just create a plot of that new variable that I think I have to run this. Oops, okay, it gave some warning. So, okay, so it looks like it couldn't use the barcodes to join the variables. So I'm not sure if this was an error, but I think it's okay. Okay, let's keep going and see. And we'll just make a box plot again instead of by the site. This time we'll make it by the scientific name or the species. Scientific name, the subset. Again, we want to just look at the D13C and then just some formatting things. Okay. So it looks like we were able to get the plot by each of the species. And then here you can see a little bit more clearly that there's certain species are much more enriched relative to others. I'm definitely not an expert on isotopes, but I did ask about this, and it sounds like the enriched carbon is often a feature of different photosynthetic pathways. But in aquatic species like this, sometimes there are different things at play. So this would be something that, okay, you plot up the data, you look at it, and then you try and figure out, okay, what are the patterns I'm seeing, and kind of start to do your exploratory analysis from there. But this would be kind of how you would approach working with some of the OS data. Any questions on this so far? And, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So whenever you do, I can't remember what the function is now, but are you always downloading the data? There's no way to just do this in the cloud?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just pull up this load by table. Oops, I just want to pull up the options here. Oh, sorry, it's not load. I meant to do blanking here. The load by product. Okay, so in the load by product, you'll actually see there is this cloud mode option. This is new, and this is something that Claire is actually talking about in her breakout session today. And so there is now a way to work with the data directly in the cloud. But I would just recommend that you watch her training video, and eventually we'll put a tutorial out about that, because we're not kind of broadly advertising this at this point, but it is something that's new, and we're expecting this will be kind of a way people will go in the future. But we just want people to use it with caution at this point. So that's all I'll say. But yeah, great point. By default, everything is just downloaded locally, but there is an option for cloud mode. Okay, great question. And then in the rest of this, we'll just look at the AOP data, which shouldn't take too long, but this is my area of interest a little bit more, since it's the team I work on. So unlike the IS and OS data, these load by product functions will not work for AOP data, because AOP data is delivered as primarily raster or point cloud or HDF5 files. So kind of a different file format and a different way that it's organized and delivered. So we have two separate functions that work for the AOP data. And these are, so we'll just say download AOP data. These are called by file AOP and by tile AOP. So the difference between these, and I'll just go ahead and show them real quick, by file AOP, is that the by file AOP will download all files for a site for a given data product ID, site, and year. Whereas by tile AOP allows you to subset by the geospatial information. So for example, if you went through and found the locations of the TOS data, then you could input those locations and only download the AOP data surrounding the OS or even IS data. For that would be one use case. But for the by tile AOP, you need to know the eastings and northings, and you can provide these either as a single value or as a list of values, but the lists need to be the same size for each, because you're basically downloading the tiles that are in that location. So just in the interest of not downloading too much data to your local computer, we'll use by tile AOP. at the ref or Wind River site, the same site that we were looking at before. So, and this is where the Python package actually has a little bit more features right now in terms of determining what dates of data are available, as well as what the spatial extent of some of the sites. Like if you're not sure what easting or northing to include, I'll just point that out real quick. And actually I forgot, in addition to the tutorial that you can follow along with, I'll just drop this. Oops, sorry, I lost myself here. Stop share. Okay, sorry, getting lost in Zoom World. For those of you who are using Python, I'll just drop this link. It's a link to a markdown file that shows how to work with. It's just a script you could work with directly. And I'll just show real quick the options in Python because I think they're a little handy. So switching screens again. Okay, this is just a Python notebook. Apologies for the switch here, but okay, so in Python, there's a function called list available dates that you can specify both the data product ID and the site, and then that tells you the available dates as well as for provisional as well as released data. So example for Wind River and the canopy height model data product, which is what this DPID is, you can see that there's provisional data available from this past July, and then there's released data from 2017 to 2023. So this may be like if you're not sure what data to download and you don't want to go to the portal to look at the availability, this would be like a first thing that you might want to do. And typically AOP data, unlike the observational or the instrumented data, will be collected only once a year. In fact, it's about three out of every 5 years for each site. And so you may not see data every year. For example, we're missing Wind River data from 2020 and 2022 and 2024. So you may wish to understand what years of data were collected first. And then you can also use this function get AOP tile extents, and that you have to provide the data product ID, the site, and the year. And then that will give you the bounds of the data set in the UTM coordinates. So that's the UTM XY positions here, easting and northing. And then if you want the extents of all the tiles, you can just print out this variable here. So I'm not sure if this will still run because this is in a notebook that I ran yesterday, but 2017 extent. If I run that, okay, it looks like it did work. This gives you the coordinate pairs of all of the data tiles. And just stepping back a bit, the AOP level 3 data is delivered in 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer tiles, and then the tile name or the tile position is in the name of the tile. So if you're working with data online, then that's something to keep in mind if you don't want to work with the entire site, for example. Okay, thanks for the little aside there. I'll go back to R. And then again, those functions are not available in R, so you would actually have to go to the website at this point, would be the simplest way to figure out what data are available if you're not sure. Okay, so going back to RStudio. This part should be pretty similar in R and Python for the rest of it. So we'll go ahead and use by tile AOP and set the data product ID. As I mentioned before, this is the canopy height or model data set or the ecosystem structure, which tells you the height of the trees, and it's derived from the LiDAR data, the point cloud data. You can specify the site, let's say 2017, but you could also do a later year, like even 2025. Easting, let's say 58. There's 4 zeros here, and northing 5075 with 3 zeros. And then here you can specify the save path. So if I want it to download to my download directory, I think I had set that to be root path, or it'd be root path with downloads. So if I want it to download to my download directory, I can say downloads. And if you don't specify the save path by default, it will download to your working directory. So let's go ahead and run this line. It's just 1 tile, so it shouldn't be too much data. It looks like it's 4 megabytes. And it's actually downloading 6 files, and that's because in addition to the data tiles, AOP also delivers what we call metadata files, and these are things like shape files that show you the extent of the boundary, and then as well as QA reports and things like that. So let's go ahead and look in our download folder where we just downloaded the data. Hopefully I can find it. Okay. So hopefully in your download folder, you'll see something it should download it to a folder called dp3 dot this whole data product name here. So let's look at that. So in my case, in my download folder, I can see that. And then if you go into this AOP products folder, 2017, and then keep clicking through, you'll see there's both a metadata folder, and that's where I mentioned the boundary files are often contained. So in this case, we have a shape file and then the associated files that describe the boundary of that tile that we downloaded, as well as KMLs. So you could drop this into Earth Engine to see where that data lands. And then the actual data are contained in this L3 discrete LiDAR canopy height model folder. And then each of the data products will have its own data path. So apologies, it's kind of nested, but there is a way that you can just find the data that are downloaded programmatically. I just won't show that in this case. Okay, so this is our data tile, and you can go ahead and just copy this path. That's probably the simplest way to read that into your program, but I can show also how to find it in the code. So share the RStudio. Okay, so the last step here is we'll just plot that data that we just read in. And we can use the Terra package to do that. Okay, maybe if we have a little bit of time at the end, I'll show how to find those files if you don't want to go digging through your file explorer. But so we'll use the raster function, or rast. And actually I did copy it, so I could just do that. I'll paste. And you can see it's kind of a long path here. So that's the path I copied from the file explorer. But you could also find it from the product will be fairly expected here. So let's just go ahead and read that in real quick. I think I might have to include, sorry, this is an R thing. I might have to do forward slashes, but in Python you can just do R. Let's see if that works. No.
Yeah, it'll have to be forward slashes.
Okay, I'll just switch these real quick. So kind of annoying, but okay. So hopefully this works now. Okay. Okay, so we've read in the canopy height model data. I can see it here. It's a spatial raster data type. And then we can plot it fairly simply just using the plot function here. So plot C, and we can just specify, in this case, I'll specify 7 different discrete colors and run that. Okay, looks like, oh, we have just 1 minute. Okay, good. We got to the end. So unfortunately, not a lot of time for questions, but you can see we plotted the canopy height model, and this is the height in meters. So some of the trees are above 60 meters. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, this triangle is this kind of clear-cut area, and the darker blues that are less than 20 meters. And so this is one of our sites with the highest trees. And this is just one way to read in some of the AOP-derived spatial data. So yeah, apologies there weren't more time for questions, but please reach out if you have any questions, or if anything came up, or if you want to go over anything in Python or anything else. But thank you all.